ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi there. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know we've just announced a big live national tour. Conversations Live will be coming to your capital city in August, and we'd love to see you there. Tickets are on sale now. Just go to the Conversations website to find out more. Hannah Kent first came on Conversations back in 2013 when her first novel, Burial Rites, was released. Burial Rites went on to become something of a phenomenon. It was published all over the world and received enormous critical acclaim. The book was based on the story of a woman named Agnes Magnusdottir, who was the last woman to be executed in Iceland. Agnes was condemned to death after the murder of two men, and she was beheaded in an open field in front of dozens of witnesses in the year 1830. Hannah Kent first learnt of Agnes when she was living in Iceland as a teenage exchange student. After a bit of a rocky start, Hannah fell in love with Iceland, and even after she came back to Australia, Hannah felt Agnes's story pressing into her mind and imagination. And so she went back to Iceland to research the life of Agnes Magnusdottir for her novel. The landscape of Iceland is intensely dramatic. The place feels very otherworldly. And in her struggle to uncover the facts of Agnes's life and death, Hannah experienced some amazing moments of serendipity and others that were deeply unsettling and eerie. Hannah's now written a memoir that's also a love letter to that faraway island of stories at the top of the world. It's called Always Homesick, Always Home. And we recorded this conversation at Melbourne's Athenaeum Theatre for this year's Melbourne Writers' Festival.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, everyone.
I dream about Iceland several times a year. Are you similarly afflicted with this?
Yeah, if you can call it an affliction, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's funny, I probably think of Iceland several times throughout the day. I have a watch and there's another little clock in the middle of its face and it's always set to Icelandic time. So every time I check the time, I'm reminded of Iceland. It's just this little way of just sending regard to, you know, a place which has become incredibly special and relevant for me.
You've resisted writing a memoir until now. What changed your mind?
The dreams you speak of. I think that's what came first. I had this really quite extraordinary period when I had just given birth to my second child, my son. COVID, the first COVID national lockdown had just started, and this coincided probably with about 2 weeks where every night I would have the most vivid dreams of being in Iceland, and I was invariably standing in the landscape. Sometimes I recognised where I was. Sometimes I knew I was in Söderkróka, which was the place where I stayed as an exchange student. Sometimes I was somewhere else. I was either with the lava, I was on the shore of black sand, and there was always this intense feeling outside of the sort of extreme detail of the land that I was in. There was this great sense of anticipation. And I would wake from these dreams, and my whole day would be held hostage to memory of them. I could not get them out of my head. And then around this time, you know, when we're inside and I knew I couldn't go anywhere and I was feeling kind of delirious with fatigue, having a newborn, my mother, you know, she was like, well, I've been going through the files and here's a giant box of all your memorabilia from when you're a kid. You know, I've got a new... I'm like, when am I going to go through this? But I did start looking through this box, and in it I found every single email I had sent home during my original exchange, and I found milk cartons that I had saved and letters and playlists and photographs, and I thought, it's so strange that all this material should come back to me at this time when I'm afflicted with these dreams. And the thought came to me that, you know, maybe I still have something to say about this. And I kicked it down the path. I had a book due at the time, which would be devotion. But the whole time that I was writing devotion, I was glancing at this giant... I didn't move the cardboard box. Just, you know, sitting there in my study and thinking, okay, yes, I think I have to get to it. And as soon as I started writing it, the dream stopped.
What was it like to get reacquainted with your teenage self?
You know, it was actually a beautiful thing. I had forgotten so much, and it was curious to me to discover journals that I'd had very little memory writing, and I was struck by how much detail and interiority and a lot of processing I had set down. I'm not a big diary keeper. I don't keep a journal in my day-to-day life, but during my time in Iceland, I had. And so it was, you know, suddenly faced with a tidal wave of recollection. And it was extraordinary to me then to be able to quite easily measure growth as a person. You know, I was able to think, oh, wow, I've actually come a long way. I'm much more confident in who I am. But, you know, I felt such affection for my younger self. I felt like I kind of wanted to, I felt motherly towards her. I felt, oh, you know, you're a big warrior, you know. You'll be all right. You'll be okay. Get it out. Put it on the paper. You'll be okay.
I hope I don't creep you out, but I felt fatherly towards your younger self.
I'll take that, Richard. That's okay.
You wanted to become a writer pretty much as soon as you could read. When you decided that, your mum started telling you about the dreaming spots she had as a little kid. What were some of your dreaming spots where you'd daydream, think, and make up stories?
They were all outside. I had the wonderful privilege of being raised on Paramount Country in the Adelaide Hills, and we were surrounded by trees. And there was one tree in particular which became very important to me. We had this very large oak tree, very old oak tree, down by the dam, and you could go into it, by which I mean the canopy was so broad it came down to the ground. So you would go in and it was like being in a room. And we had a trampoline there, you know, the real old kind where your hair gets snagged in the springs. And I would climb up onto the trampoline and look up at the canopy, and that was probably the most memorable one. But also at the end of the day, I loved climbing on top of the rainwater tank, which was concrete, so it was beautiful and warm, and looking up at the sky. All of this makes me sound like a very wistful child, and I guess I was in many ways. But, I also liked to go over to another paddock where we had and, you know, kind of sit down amongst the gum leaves and the sheep poo and just look out over the hill. That was another, yeah.
The paddock of sheep poo where I dreamt my dreams.
So poetic.
In Year 12, you famously applied for the local Rotary Club's student exchange program. What a wonderful thing to do. What did you say when they asked you where you wanted to go in the world?
Well, I didn't know. My focus and all my energy had really been on just going somewhere. You know, the idea of 12 months not in my home, not in Australia. And so when I did have to finally tick the form of the countries, you're not allowed to choose, but you get to nominate. I thought to myself, you know, well, what do I really want to see? And I didn't know. I hadn't travelled. I didn't really have an idea of what was out there. But, you know, I'd never seen snow before. When I was 15, a few flakes had fallen during an English class, and everyone had gone completely nuts and run outside and tried to, you know, catch them. And they, of course, melted. And I thought, well, you know, it'd be nice to see it as it really is. I'd love to see snow. So I think I put down Switzerland and Norway. And, yeah, I don't think I ticked Iceland. I didn't even know that was an opportunity, actually.
And when they came back and said, we're sending you to Iceland, what did you think?
I thought, wow. I
like
know
a good
nothing.
wow or a bad wow?
I think just an interested wow, but I knew nothing about the place. I knew nothing, and it was not what I had expected. I actually thought I was probably being sent to Europe, because I'd already found out that many of the other applicants had been sent there, and I was certain that I would also be sent there.
When I was a little boy, I had a tin globe of the world on my desk, one of those old-fashioned tin globes, and I used to always fixate on the top part around where the spindle met the little cap and where all the lines of longitude converged at the top. And I used to look at the islands there because they struck me as being fantastical. And it was only Iceland, though, that had a dot for a city on it. And the city, because the globe was small, was marked Reyk, R-E-Y-K, dot. And I used to think, how can there be a city so far north? How do people live in all that ice and snow? What was Iceland to you as a teenager or even as a kid?
At the time, I knew that it was far away. I knew that Björk came from there. I was a big fan of her music. And my aunt gave me 6 sheets torn out of a Gourmet Traveller, which was about cod. And that was really the extent of it. So I knew they ate a lot of fish, and I knew it was far away. And, you know, but really I tried very, very hard to find information, and there was so little available.
So you flew there from Adelaide, which you say was 3 days' journey to hop from Adelaide to Europe to Iceland. Please tell the story of what happened when you landed close to midnight in Reykjavik.
Well, I'd had a stopover in Amsterdam, and I had seen another Rotary Exchange student be greeted by their host family there, and there had been balloons and a giant sign, and it got me really excited for what was waiting for me. And then, of course, I pulled into Keflavik Airport, and, I'm wearing this blazer, which was dark green, which would have been fine, but it was completely covered in all these badges and flags and all the sort of detritus they make you sort of wear as an exchange student to be identified, and I was so conspicuous. So I come marching out in this hideous blazer, and, all the Icelanders are kind of looking at me, and no one comes up. There's no sign. I stand there for a few more minutes. Everyone's being greeted and moving away, and then I think, okay, there's no one here. So I moved to the side, and I thought, well, they're late. They've been held up. I don't know if Iceland has traffic, maybe at midnight in this country, and I wait. I ended up thinking, okay, maybe something's gone wrong. I should probably try and contact someone. I didn't have a mobile, of course, back then. I went up to a car rental hire counter and asked the man there, I'm sorry, I think I've been forgotten. I maybe need to call someone, tell them that I'm actually here. He didn't say anything, just gave me a bunch of coins. They all had fish on them. Dragged my suitcase over to a payphone, which he'd pointed out to me, put the numbers in, found the phone number, called it. There was this beautiful stream of this language. I couldn't even tell the words apart. I'm trying to interrupt this woman, say, sorry, yes, sorry, it's Talathuensku, do you speak English? It's Hannah, I finally arrived. And then she hangs up on me. And so I'm like, okay, I had a few more coins, I put it in, I called it again. And this time I realised that it's the equivalent of, your call could not be connected. And so I go back to the car hire place, and he's not there. And then I realise that all the lights are being switched off and someone's vacuuming, and I'm thinking, really just don't know what to do. Do I just stay here? And I thought, well, yeah, I guess so. I don't have any other numbers. So I went and sat down in a corner, and eventually I see someone come towards me, and I'm smiling at her and I wave, and she's not waving back. And as she comes to me, I stand up and I realise she's a security guard. And she speaks to me in Icelandic. Again, I'm sorry, I'm an exchange student. Someone was supposed to pick me up, and she's just like, where are you going? And I said, well, I don't even really know. They're just supposed to be here. She asked for the number. I gave it to her. She dialed it. She's like, yeah, no, this phone number isn't working. But you have to go because the airport's closing. And I was like, well, do I wait outside, pointing to the snow that I could see in the streetlights? She looks at me like I'm a complete idiot, says, no, don't do that. She points to a bus and says, you have to get on that bus, it's going to go to Reykjavik. And I was like, when do I get off? She's like, just wait at the end, you have to get off at the stop in the city. And I was like, I don't have any money, I don't have a ticket. She's like, go, it's leaving now, you have to go. So I leave my gloves on the floor, I'm dragging my suitcase, slap the side of the bus because the doors have closed, it opens, I get on, and then I'm just sitting there looking out the window thinking, where am I? I couldn't see anything. Finally pull in, all the passengers get off, finally pull into the bus stop, and there's a man in a dressing gown waiting for me saying, sorry, Anna, welcome to Iceland. I forgot you were coming.
How nice he came out in his dressing gown to pick you up. So then the next day you catch a flight in a tiny plane to the north of Iceland, to the tiny town of Sauðárkrókur. This time there were some people waiting for you?
Yes, thank goodness, yes.
And this is the first family you stayed with. And something wasn't right there either, was there?
Yeah, it was an interesting time staying with this family. I remember, I have this very strong memory of finally pulling up at their house, and their son was outside, standing in the door, looking at us, and I, waved and introduced myself, and he kind of gave me a look and then just turned around and went back inside. And I remember asking, my host father, does he speak English? And he was like, oh, yes, very well, very good English. And I was like, okay, maybe I've done something already. I've made a cultural faux pas, or I've offended him. But this kind of silence, that kind of characterised my stay with this family. They kept to themselves a great deal. My host brother probably said about 3 sentences to me during my entire stay, and they spent a great deal of time leaving me alone in the house. So it was unfortunate that that experience also coincided with, the height of Icelandic winter, where it was dark for 21 hours of the day, and I didn't speak the language, and I had to attend a school where I had to take maths and classes like that in Icelandic. And
How are you at Icelandic trigonometry at Year 12 level?
That was my first class at 8 o'clock in the morning at this high school I had to attend as part of the exchange. I remember sitting down and the teacher read my name and was like, welcome, and then proceeded to teach this class of mathematics, which is also not my strong suit at the best of times.
I don't think I've been able to walk 5 paces anywhere in Iceland without having to stop and take in the majesty of it all. And it's like everywhere in Iceland. How forcibly were you struck by that majesty in Söderkirkju?
I still remember that view from that little kitchen window when I went there to say good morning to this new host family, and I looked out and I saw the mountain Tindastóll, which sort of comes right out over the edge of this fjord, and I could see the sea, which was this gunmetal grey, and the sky was just lifting out of this kind of extraordinary blue, which I don't think we really have here in Australia. I'd never seen that colour before. And then when we were on this walk, there was a moment when we turned back and I could see inland, and I had never seen so far before. It was just, and it occurred to me that there were no trees, which I also did not know about Iceland. And I thought, how extraordinary. It immediately changed my relationship to nature and to the landscape, because I felt very small in it. I could see how far it extended. And that was a wonderful feeling, really. But the light, just the quality of the light, was unlike anything I had seen before.
Your slightly standoffish host dropped you off without any explanation with the theatre company one evening. What role did they find for a non-Icelandic-speaking teenager like yourself, Hannah?
That was one of the more excruciating experiences when he dropped me off. I literally had no idea where we were going. He summoned me at about 8 o'clock at night and then told me to get in the car. And by this stage, so much was being lost in communication. I thought, I've forgotten some sort of social engagement I'm being dragged along to. And then he dropped me off essentially in this warehouse on the sort of the industrial side of the town. And he opens the door and there's a room full of people stop and turn and stare at me. And I hear him say, okay, I'll pick you up in 2 hours. And then left. And I'm like, it's like, those nightmares when you're on stage and you're not supposed to know what you're doing. And they sort of started speaking to me in Icelandic. And I was like, I'm so sorry, I don't speak Icelandic. And they said, oh, you're the exchange student. And I was like, yes. Can you please tell me who you are? They said, well, we're the local theatre company, but you won't be able to be part of this play that we're putting on because you don't speak the language. And I was like, no, sorry. And then they went and kind of conferred amongst themselves, and eventually they came back and said, okay, maybe you can be like our slave. And by this stage, I was just so grateful I could do something in this room. I was like, yes, anything, I will do it. And they're like, because we really need somebody to, mop the blood off the floor. And they must have seen the look on my face, and then they proceeded to explain that the play they were putting on required several actors to be killed violently on stage, and they needed a props girl to, let off starter guns and, clean up the blood after the production. So that's really how I started to find my way into the community, and also how I started learning Icelandic, looking at the script. All my first words that I learnt were, blood and murder and ghosts.
You saw a production of one of my favourite Icelandic ghost stories, The Deacon of Dark River, which, just put very briefly, there's a deacon who's engaged to a woman and he comes to see her and promises he'll come back, and I think it's on Christmas Eve, isn't it? But while he's riding away, his horse trips across the stream and he falls into the stream and his head is cracked open by a rock and he dies. She's unaware of this. And on Christmas Eve, she looks out the window and there's the deacon on his horse. And he's stuttering, because ghosts in Iceland stutter.
Yeah, they repeat themselves.
And he asks her to get on the horse. Horse, come with me now. And she sees the crack into his head under the moonlight. And he takes her to the cemetery. And he gets into his own grave and tries to pull her into it with him, but just grabs her coat instead. I don't know of any other nation that has such rich ghost folklore. There's the Droga, which is the unhappy ghost, which might actually physically tear people apart. And there's the Utbura. The Utbura is the ghost of an infant left out to be exposed to the cold. These are really creepy stories. Why do you think Iceland is so rich with vivid, very distinctive ghost stories?
I don't know. I feel like there's a very long history, but I think also that the landscape and the weather lend itself to ghosts in that I remember listening to the wind, for example, when I was first there, and I had never experienced wind like it. To this day, if I know someone is going to Iceland, I will say, trust that you need to hold on to the car door when you get out because they can be blown off. Such is the force. And I remember there were some incredibly windy days and I was lying in bed and I could hear the wind in a way that I had never heard it before. And it sounded exactly like a wailing woman. And I wonder whether the dominance of the nature and of weather, of extreme weather in that place very easily embellishes people's imagination. But also I believe that these ghost stories are true, Someone once said to me that this was an Icelander, saying that Icelanders have a real respect of the supernatural. But in Iceland, it's not supernatural. It's just part of day-to-day living. I had many conversations and many stories which are presented in this very matter-of-fact way. And yet there's always something slightly inexplicable involved. But in the story, it makes perfect sense. So I'm not sure why it is, but I wonder whether it is the weather, whether it is the darkness, whether it's the brutality of Icelandic history, particularly. This was a very difficult place to live.
The famines.
The
long spectral twilight.
Yeah, the glaciers, the volcanic eruptions and the darkness and the falling of ash. The close relationships, perhaps, too, the very close kin ties. But they're very predominant. They were the first stories that I really heard about Iceland when I was there. And they were always introduced to me and told to me when I was moving through the land. So I think they are connected somehow to Icelandic nature.
And this brings me to Agnes Magnusdottir, the last woman to be executed in Iceland in 1830, who was the subject of your best-selling first novel, Burial Rites. How were you introduced to the story? Is that the word? I don't know. How was she introduced to you, might be a better way of putting it?
I was still with my first host family, and we were driving south to Reykjavik, and we passed through this extraordinary sort of valley mouth where suddenly there were just thousands, many, many hundreds of small hillocks, and me knowing nothing, really. I was sort of struck by them, and I remember leaning forward from the back seat and saying, are these Viking burial mounds? And they sort of looked at me and said, no, it's not that. But no, this was caused by a, snowflood, an avalanche. And then they said, oh, but it's interesting, this place, because we had just passed it. There were 3 hills to the side. And my host mother pointed to them and said, those 3 hills are called Tristapar. And that's where the last execution happened in Iceland. And of course, I was immediately interested, because who wouldn't be? I was like, what happened and what did he do? I think I had assumed it would be a man. And I was told, no, it was a woman. She was called Agnes, and she killed this man that she worked for. His name was Nathan, and she stabbed him to death. And there were 2 other people involved as well, but we think that she was probably the one who made them do it. And I was immediately intrigued. I thought, why? Why did she kill this man she worked for? And they couldn't really give me a satisfying answer. They sort of just said, well, I can't remember all the story, but I think maybe she was bad. I think maybe she was in love with him. And then he said, I don't want to be with you. And so she went crazy. And I was like, oh, that doesn't satisfy my curiosity. And I kept thinking of her for the rest of that journey. And that night, I kept thinking of her too. And to this day, I still don't know exactly why, of the many, many stories that were told to me during that year. She took on this almost, she kind of occupied, my curiosity in a way that I hadn't really experienced before. I think I just really wanted to know who she was, and I didn't believe this idea that she had done this thing just because she was a bad person. I think it felt very unusual, and I wanted to know her reasons. I'm not sure. I think there was probably something to do with the site of those 3 hills. It was March. I remember there was sort of still snow on the ground. The ground was very low, and I could see rainfall passing in the distance. And it seemed an incredibly lonely place then when I heard that story. It just settled within me.
So spring came at last, and the world was waking up in Iceland. And you'd picked up some Icelandic language, and you'd even made some lovely friends. And then you moved in with a new host family who you now call your second family.
Yeah.
This is Pieter and Regina's home. How different was this home?
Well, I think Pieter could see that I was pretty unhappy at this first family. And he said, you're going to, good news, you're coming to us next. And I went there, and he had 4 kids under the age of 10. So I went from this silent house to a house which was just filled with children and all the chaos and joy that they bring. And not only those children, but all their friends, because Pietro and Regina kind of kept an open house. People would just come in and out all the time. They were very warm and I think very embracing of me and understanding that I was quite a shy person. I really enjoyed hanging out with the kids who didn't really speak English. They wanted to kind of connect with me, so suddenly I felt motivated. And they also had a 1-year-old, little Birgitta, who was just starting to learn Icelandic, and I was about the same, so we kind of learned it together. But they had such warmth. And now that I'm a parent, I'm like, oh my gosh, Pietro and Regina, 4 kids, and they're like, sure, what's another? Come on in. Incredibly generous, yeah.
You got a job as a dishwasher in a cafe for the holidays. And at this time, you said your perception of Icelanders as being cold and standoffish was changing. What do you perceive that as now?
I had a lot of quite unusual experiences which seemed to me that people just were completely uninterested. So, people would roll down the windows of their cars as they passed by me in the street if I was out for a walk and just stare at me. And then I could hear them saying, oh, yeah, that's the exchange student, that's her. And I would sort of stand there expecting a conversation, then they'd just roll up the windows and drive on. And at the time, I was like, oh, my gosh, no one wants to, be my friend. But I think what I started to realize was that Icelanders seem to be very respectful of people's space, and that relationships in this town particularly were often forged at quite a young age. And so it was sometimes difficult to break into these new circles, but also that I think this reserved nature was simply them probably, I think giving me that space, but also maybe just waiting to see how I was going to connect with them. Things really started to change when I started learning the language, because I think people could then see that I was actively trying to be part of things.
And then the glory of the Icelandic summer unfolded. It's like heaven itself, isn't it, Hannah?
It's extraordinary. I remember the first time I was taken right out to the edge of the fjord to watch the midnight sun, and you could see it come down, and it started to turn this deep red, and then it just kissed the sea, just kissed the horizon, and then started coming back up again. And everything was just in this beautiful, deep red light. It was extraordinary. And Iceland is... It's quite difficult to describe. I think this is why I'm always drawn to writing about it, because I want to try and distill the quality of the light and the extraordinary expansiveness that you feel in an Icelandic summer. I want to try and capture it somehow, because it's still always slightly eluding me. It's still something which seems to me quite ephemeral.
I remember going to Egil Skallagrimsson's farm from the sagas in the farm called Borg in the west of Iceland, and in the summer the grass sort of came up to my chest, and I was afforded the luxury, which Australians never experience, of lying down in the long grass without any fear whatsoever. There's no snakes. And to feel the kind of the sun's warmth on my face, but the cold breeze going across it, looking at the Arctic sun is such a rare pleasure, isn't it, to be able to do that?
You could go up to places and you would see the animals which are left to roam over the mountainsides over the summer. You just see them. You just see horses and lambs. It's idyllic. It's extraordinary.
I'd like you to read from your book, Hannah, a description of the period when you went to work on a farm for a while and you went on a trek up into the mountain valleys in the north where the farm was. I'd just love you to read this lovely passage from it, please.
On one of my last days at Syðri-Hofdalir, a friend of the family takes me on a trek up through the mountain valleys with Sarah and some friends. In the narrow, grassy corridors between the peaks, we find horses with their foals left to roam the lush highland grasses. We also find great fields of blueberries and bilberries, and in the late hours, bright unhurry, we sit among the sprawling shrubs and eat our fill. At midnight, the valley before me is still held in deep colour. When I look down at my hands, my skin is blushed red, and I feel suddenly that I will be forever standing in this hidden place, out of time, that the world has slung from orbit and is now unspinning, unspun, content to rest forever in such tender light.
When I was there in the summer, I felt that the almost endless days where the sun dips down, as you say, and then pops back up again, it made me feel like a kid again. You know how it is when you're a kid? A summer's day goes on forever and ever and ever, and you never get that back as an adult unless you go to Iceland. That's why I love that last part of your reading there, that sense of being untethered from the weight of time almost.
Yeah, that was my experience too. I also had terrible curtains in this second host family's room. They were yellow and they emitted a huge amount of light, and I became an insomniac. So the days did feel particularly long. But I also didn't mind it at all. There was something about it. I mean it when I say it felt unhurried. It felt as though everything had slowed down. That's exactly my experience too. There's a slackening of the hours. You seem to fall out of time a little.
Then a very happy Christmas came around for you. Yeah. Iceland has no Santa, no Father Christmas. It has the Yule Boys, which are kind of like these gremlins, aren't they? Elves, I don't know what they are, but they're naughty.
The children of Grilla, who's this terrible ogress who eats children. Very cosy Christmas tales in Iceland.
It's a slightly less demanding of presents with such people. And in the lead-up, you mentioned the Jólabókaflóð, which is the Christmas book flood there. Because everyone in Iceland writes books about themselves, pretty much. I think it's got the highest population per capita head of published authors in the world.
Yeah, I think so. I think they read more books and publish more books per capita than anywhere else in the world. And of course, Icelanders always laugh at the per capita because, when I was there was only 250,000 of them. So they like to ratio everything out. But yeah, it's extraordinary, the centrality of literature to, I guess, certainly, I wouldn't even say arts culture, I think just Icelandic culture.
Before you left Iceland, you had dinner with that awkward first family you first stayed with, and they were warmer this time. What do you think was going on while you were staying there?
I don't know. I haven't stayed in touch with them, and they haven't necessarily reached out to me. I mean, I still think it's an incredibly generous thing to welcome a stranger into your home, and I don't want to take away from that because I'm still very glad that they took me in and that they still fed me and there was a lot of generosity in hosting me.
But could they have been going through some kind of invisible ordeal that something was going on that you weren't aware of?
I think that's it, absolutely. And as an adult, and certainly when I was writing this memoir and returning to, the things I had written down in my emails home, I was able to sort of think, oh, no, this wasn't about you. This wasn't about you speaking enough Icelandic or not being extroverted enough. I think that they were probably going through their own things, as families sometimes do.
And then you had to leave. And how hard was it to leave?
It was terrible. I hadn't actually thought about leaving beyond what I wanted to study when I got home, which was an abstract idea. Iceland, in its love and reverence for writers, had convinced me that it was worth pursuing, and I decided to apply to do creative writing at university, and I had needed to compile a portfolio of writing to send, and that was the extent of my thinking about the future, because by that stage I had felt very much part of the community. I had a job, I didn't really speak English anymore, I was dreaming in Icelandic, I had a family, and then suddenly I think, oh no, I'm leaving it, and I think the great difficulty of that was not knowing if I would come back. It was the sense of finality.
How did Agnes stay with you after you left Iceland?
Dreams are coming up a lot tonight. I started dreaming about her. I started dreaming about her fairly infrequently as I was going on and doing university and all these sorts of things. And then I started dreaming her with greater frequency to the point where kind of spooked me a little bit. So I started writing the dreams down. I kept them in a journal. And then I found that the dreams, again, kind of cast their light into my waking day. And I would be at the library researching assignments, and suddenly I would find myself researching, typing in search terms like Lugastaðir, the farm where the murders took place, or Agnes Magnusdottir. And I started reading about it. And at this stage, I had no inclination to do anything with this information. I was still trying to satisfy my curiosity. But then everything I read made me continually frustrated at how little was known about her life. And I realised I wanted to know not just about why she was found guilty of doing this particular crime. I wanted to know about her early life. I wanted to know about how she ended up in this situation. And there was so little biographical information. And then the dreams just intensified to the point where I think I was like, I need to do something with this.
The axe and the block used for her beheading was, and probably still is, in the National Museum. What did you see when you saw that on display?
I found it by accident. I had spent probably about 18 months doing quite in-depth research by this stage because I had decided to write a novel, and I thought, well, there's only so much I can access in Australia. I'm going to get everything I can. I'm going to become incredibly familiar with 19th century Iceland. And then eventually I got funding to go on a research trip. And I was aware that the axe and the block were there in the museum. And on the first day that I arrived, I had given myself the day off. I thought, I'll go for a walk. And then I ended up, as it happens, at the National Museum. I stumbled upon it. I thought, well, I'm here now, I'll go in. And I walked in, I was incredibly jet-lagged, and I looked around, and suddenly I looked down to my right, and there it was. I knew it immediately, there it was. And I don't remember there being any glass over it. I don't know if there is now. But I was struck immediately at how real, that sounds a bit silly, but how real these objects were. And it was an incredibly sobering moment for me because I think by that stage it was still a story. And now I understood it to be, no, this happened. These were real people.
There's a notch in it for her chin, isn't there?
Yes.
It had a rested chin on it.
I saw this little bit carved out, and I was looking at it for a long time because I was aware that the block had been ordered in especially for the execution. I thought, well, what is this bit? And then I realised, oh, it's for the chin. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense because you'd be sitting, and I was like, oh, no, you have to extend your neck over it to fit your chin in this notch. You would have to have your neck completely stretched out over the length of the block.
You were looking for a specific book on Agnes and the murders that was published in the 1970s called No One May Look Away, which is a wonderful title. What does it refer to?
It refers to the instruction issued by the District Commissioner, Björn Blöndal, to all the people who were present to witness the execution. And that's what he said, Ingen má undan líta, no one may look away.
So tell me the saga of what happened when you went to look for this book in the archives and in the libraries of Iceland.
Well, Iceland used to have this amazing catalogue which listed all the books essentially across all the libraries, and sometimes it gave you sort of chapter headings as well. And I had found this book by researching in Australia, and when I had looked at it on the catalogue listing, I could see that there was an entire chapter titled Agnes, and this was the first I had come across it. And I thought, well, here, this looks promising. This is a whole chapter just about Agnes. I haven't found anything like this. And so I noted where it was listed in all the various libraries. And when I got there, I went to the first library, I asked for it. The woman was like, yep, no problem, took me to the shelf, and it wasn't on the shelf. She was like, that's really strange, I'm sorry. I can call you if it turns up, but it should be there. And I was like, oh, that's okay. I knew there were other copies. I went to the next library, and they said, no, we've never had it, I don't know why it's in the catalogue. And I was like, that's okay, there's some more libraries. And I went to another one, and she said, no, the listing is described as having been destroyed in a fire. Basically, I had zero success, and they had told me to check bookstores, but it was out of print. I couldn't find it anywhere, which was in some ways a good thing because it made me really return to that process of finding primary sources in the archives and the libraries. And I did find a lot of information. I found Agnes in the census material. I found her in the priest's books. And then eventually I had quite a lot of information. I thought, okay, I'm going to go up north. I'm going to go somewhere really isolated, and I'm going to sit with all this information, this deluge of information that I now have about her life. And I found this hostel called Osar, which was actually a dairy farm with a spare barn where they had a bunch of beds. And I got there, and the farmer there, who was the dairy farmer, and he also grew barley, sort of came up and he was like, oh, welcome. This place is in the middle of nowhere. It's quite a long drive from the nearest shop, off-road. And he comes up and he's like, it's nice to have you, but, what are you doing here? Most people come here in the summer. It wasn't summer. And I was like, oh, well, have you heard of Agnes Magnusdottir? And he kind of gave me a strange look, and he's like, yes, I know about this. I know about this case. I said, well, I'm going to write a book about her. And he gave me another strange look. He said, well, okay, no, don't stay in the barn. We have a cabin. We have like a summer cabin. For a writer, you need to have a desk. And next thing I know, I'm being ushered into this beautiful little wooden cabin, looking out over the cow paddocks, and his beautiful mother is physically dragging a desk from their house. So I would have somewhere to write. And then he's like, okay, I'll let you unpack. I'll let you get on with things. And then later that night, he knocks on the door. And he's like, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I know you're hit to write, but I was thinking about what you're researching and what you're writing about, and I wanted to know if you wanted this. And he gave me a copy of Ingen má undan líta. And then, of course, my expression was, oh, my gosh. And he said, it's so strange. The reason I was thinking of this book, because I read it last week for the first time. And all of a sudden you come up and you hear, like, I'm here from Australia to write about Agnes Magnusdottir, so I think you should have it. So that's how I found it.
So this is Knútur, who turned out to be incredibly lovely and incredibly helpful to you. Helped you translate it, because it was in Icelandic, line by line. And then Agnes's story, after her execution, fast forwards to the 1930s. There's a very strange story in that book of how her bones were found and reburied in 1934. What did the book say about that?
This is an extraordinary sort of epilogue to this story that I had not been aware of until I met Knútur. And he referred to it initially. He said, you know, that she was buried in the district and in the area in which she was executed. And I was like, yeah, I was aware of that because I had seen the letters from Björn saying, you know, they're to be buried in unmarked coffins and that there was to be no sort of not consecrated ground. That was a big part of it. And yet I also had been to her grave in the church of Tjörn. And I was like, yeah, you know, it's strange that happened. How come they ended up being buried in Tjörn? And she's like, no, the bones were moved. I said, why were they moved? And he said, well, it's an extraordinary story. And then he flipped through Engimo and Donlita and he found the chapter where they describe it. And he translated it with me. And together I learned that about 100 years after Agnes had been executed, there was a woman in Reykjavik, a housewife, who had psychic ability that she largely kept to herself, who started automatic writing. She was writing these letters, but she knew that they weren't coming from her. And it was, over time, I think quite a short period of time, she realised that it was Agnes Magnusdottir communicating with her in this way. And she didn't do anything about it for quite a bit of time, but the letters continued coming, and they kept asking for the same thing. They wanted the bones moved from the side of around this valley, somewhere in the valley, to consecrated ground, specifically the churchyard at Tjörn. And the psychic eventually contacted someone and said, I think we need to do this. I think we need to move the bones. And the man was like, okay, but where are they? And everyone was sort of saying, no, we don't know. We don't know where these bones are buried. And the psychic said, well, Agnes has given instructions, and she had. And there are directions that Agnes had said, sort of offered in this kind of flow of consciousness with, you know, attention to physical landmarks and the where the sun comes up. And she had also said, my head needs to be moved too. And the man was like, well, Dad, everyone knows that the heads which had been placed on stakes after the execution had been taken in the night on the direction of a local farm woman who thought this was absolutely barbaric, and they were buried in the churchyard at Þingeyra, a local churchyard. And Agnes was like, no, they're not. They're not there. And there is still a bit of the stake in my head. And she gave further directions saying they're in a bore of gravel, etc. And she told this man, she said, tell him to go up north to Sveinstaðir, which is a farm, and tell him to look for old Magnus because he will prove to be a good searcher. And so this man ended up going up, and he kept a diary of this. And he went up to this Sveinstaðir, and there was a man called Magnus there. And Magnus didn't believe that Agnes was communicating through a psychic, but he agreed to look for the bones. And he absolutely didn't believe that the heads would be there. He was like, no, they're in Þingeyra. But he agreed to look. And so they set out the next morning, and the sun came too, Magnus's son, and the three men in 15 minutes followed Agnes's directions and found the heads. And in one of the heads was 10 centimetres of wood. And then shortly after that, they found the coffins, exactly where Agnes had described in the letters to the psychic. So the bones were moved. They were given permission to go up and bury them in the churchyard of Tjörn. But it's one of the more extraordinary aspects of this case, and something which is very well known. And the psychic too, something which is convincing to me is that she didn't want anyone to know her name until after her death. So we know it now, it was Cecilia Guðmundsdóttir. But I think her disinclination to pull any focus on her is further evidence that it probably was true.
The transcripts of her automatic writing that you were translating line by line were all run-on sentences. It was just one long stream of words. And then you got to the end, her final message. I'd like you to read that message that the medium left that she believed was from Agnes Magnusdottir.
They're extraordinary in their visual imagery. They're incredibly poetic, very, very strange indeed. And this was, I think, the last thing that was recorded from Agnes. You may say, dear daughter, that your victory is owed to me by greeting me with friendship. For the call has come, and quickly, as you wish to do for me, one thing I wish to ask of you, dear woman, is that you fulfill as far as is within your power to resolve the great sign that comes with good and noble deeds. The reed that speaks is a play that could be described in broad strokes if there were time.
She's writing that she wants to be properly known. And I think, Hannah, if I was you and I was reading that, I would feel seen by Agnes Magnusdottir. Did you feel seen by Agnes Magnusdottir?
I don't think I've ever considered that aspect of the letter was that.
The dear daughter was you. That's what I thought as soon as I read it.
Oh, I've not considered that. But I do think that there is so much that came about during the writing of this book that felt inexplicable to me. And I was reluctant to examine it with any great detail at the time because, I don't know, there was something sacred about it. And I felt like I was so focused on writing the book, I didn't want to spook myself too. But since the book came out, I've had many interesting conversations with other people who have felt Agnes's presence in their words. These include Maria Ellingsen, who was the actor who played Agnes in the 1995 film. She says that Agnes has never really let her go, and certainly shortly after production on the film ended, had extraordinary experiences whereby she needed to get the help from a psychic to rid her house of the presence of Agnes. And the first thing that Maria Ellingsen actually said to me when we met when I was in Iceland was, I see she's visited you too. It's the first thing she said. And we didn't have enough time. I didn't know whether she meant this in a literal way or whether she meant it metaphorically. And then I met her again. I went over to Iceland in 2023 for the International Literary Festival, and it ended with this big sort of dance party. And I was out on the floor dancing, and one of the Icelandic moderators came up to me and was like, Hannah, there's 2 people here to come and see you. And I go out, and it was Maria Ellingsen, and it was also the grandson of the man who found the bones, Magnus Olafsson. And they said, we've come down to see you. And we went up to the top, and together we 3 spoke about the various uncanny experiences that we have collectively had about this case, about Agnes. And I know that there is no doubt in their minds that I share in that experience.
I think in some ways that every book you write is a kind of a trap. And it's a trap you set for yourself as an author, or maybe it's the subject that sets the trap for you. And you have to write your way out of the trap, which is why authors are so happy to come to writers' festivals like these and talk about them, because they go, I got out. I escaped from my own book.
Yeah.
Did you feel you had to escape from this book by writing your way out of it?
I wouldn't necessarily say escape, but I think, I feel with all of my books, this one included, they've come at me. Like, I don't really feel like I have an opportunity. I tend to dream about them. There's like suddenly there's a great weight and everything's just always swinging to this. It's always just swinging back to a consideration of whatever it is that's interesting me, I guess, but it feels less active on my behalf. It feels more involuntary. And then it comes to a point where I'm like, I am so occupied by this that I do have to write my way out of it. But it feels more like a haunting. It feels more like I'm being followed around by this thing. And if I need to be free of it, I need to write it.
Do you dream of her?
Yeah, I do. Still to this day.
And what's she like in those dreams?
I have various versions of the same dream. I have done something and I have this terrible urge to escape, and also this dread that the truth will out. I also have this dream where my neck is cut and I only realize I'm dying when I feel the warmth of my own blood, because it's very cold, it's always snowing. And sometimes I have dreams which are slightly more abstract, and then when I wake up I recognize the flavour of them to be the same kind that I had during burial rites. But I don't always talk about them to other people. This feels like an exception. Because I think, it's very easy. I don't want it ever to seem like I'm thinking, I'm special or I'm chosen. But I think, and I'm very, very happy to put them down to just being completely obsessed with this case and with this woman, and that it's just this limbic system, in my brain processing this obsession in my sleep, and it's all coming from my unconscious. I'm very, very open to that. But I feel still that I carry Agnes in the same way that I carry all the people I have grieved for.
I'm so glad you did escape the trap of this book, and you did it with courage and enormous creative force. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Hannah Kent. Hannah Kent's memoir is called Always Homesick, Always Home. Huge thanks from us to the Melbourne Writers' Festival and the team at the Athenaeum Theatre, and to Richard Gervin from ABC Melbourne for the sound recording. This conversation was created on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Producer is Maggie Morris. EP is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.